Have you ever noticed how the people who promise you the world can also be the ones who shatter it? How someone who whispers, "I love you," at night can still carry a secret that doesn't belong in the light. It's strange, almost unsettling, how love and betrayal can live inside the same human heart, as if both emotions are two sides of a coin constantly flipping in the dark. And in quiet moments, when you're lying awake at 2 a.m., staring at the ceiling and wondering what changed, you can feel it, that soft, almost invisible shift in someone's energy, the way their eyes avoid yours, the way their phone suddenly becomes a shield held too close to their skin. You replay memories like old film reels, a dinner table where their smile didn't reach their eyes, a car ride where silence felt heavier than the air around you, a night where they came home smelling like a place you were never invited to. And even before the truth breaks open, your body knows. The heart always knows. Long before your mind dares to admit it, something inside you trembles the same way a phone does on a nightstand, shaking gently, warning softly, begging to be seen. But cheating is not just about crossing a physical line. It begins long before the betrayal. Sometimes it begins decades earlier. It begins when a person learns to split themselves into two, the version they show to the world, and the version they hide from everyone, including themselves. Psychologists call this the divided self, the emotional split that appears when a child grows up believing that honesty is unsafe, that vulnerability is punished, that love must be earned by being whoever the other person needs. And so, as adults, many people carry a hunger they can't name, a hunger for validation, for intensity, for escape from their own emptiness. This hunger becomes a shadow, and the shadow becomes a quiet monster they feed with secrecy and desire, not because they don't care for the person beside them, but because they've never fully learned how to care for themselves without destroying something in the process. The tragedy is that betrayal doesn't begin with another person. It begins with the betrayal of one's own boundaries, one's own truth, one's own emotional wounds. A person cheats long before they touch someone else. They cheat the moment they abandon their authentic self. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that cheating has less to do with love and everything to do with the hidden fractures of the human mind. To understand why someone can break the heart they once swore to protect, you must look far beyond the moment of betrayal. You must go back to the beginning, long before the lie was told, long before the secret was kept, long before the heart was broken. Only then can you understand the psychology that shapes the choices people make in the dark. Have you ever wondered why some people learn to hide their truth long before they learn to speak? You see it in the quiet child sitting at the edge of a room, watching the emotional weather of the adults around them shift like unpredictable storms. They learn early that love can vanish without warning, that affection arrives with conditions, that approval is something you earn only when you behave the right way. And in those fragile years, a seed begins to form the belief that parts of you must remain unseen to stay safe. You remember scenes like this more clearly than you realize. A child tiptoeing around a parent's temper. A little boy who stops crying because tears make his father uncomfortable. A girl who edits her thoughts before speaking because she has learned that honesty can spark conflict. And somewhere in this silent training, the child discovers the first lesson of betrayal. To survive, you must betray yourself a little. Picture that symbolic mini-story. A child with a small notebook tucked under their pillow. They scribble secrets they cannot say out loud. Fears, desires, questions about why the people who should protect them feel so distant. That notebook becomes their only safe place, the only room where they don't need a mask. What they don't know is that this habit, hiding pieces of themselves, will follow them into adulthood like a shadow stitched to their ankles. Psychologists call this the beginning of the divided self, the moment a child splits into two versions. One version learns to become acceptable, pleasing, easy to love. The other becomes the exiled self, holding all the emotions that were never welcomed: anger, confusion, sadness, longing. When affection is inconsistent or unpredictable, the child learns to adapt by suppressing what they truly feel. This emotional contortion becomes a survival skill, but it slowly drains the soul the way a garden wilts when the soil is never watered. Attachment theory explains this with painful clarity. Children deprived of stable emotional safety often grow into adults who chase validation in frantic ways, seeking in strangers what they never received consistently from family. They confuse attention with love, intensity with connection, secrecy with freedom. Their unmet needs become a quiet gravity, pulling them towards situations that feel like the comfort of old wounds. And when a child grows up watching a parent lie, cheat, or emotionally disappear, the lesson becomes even more complex. They learn that betrayal is a language spoken behind closed doors, a normal part of intimacy. They learn that people leave even when they stay. The seeds planted in that childhood soil begin to sprout into adult relationships, weaving patterns they don't consciously choose. These early fractures grow with us until the mask becomes part of who we are. Have you ever noticed how, as an adult, you can smile at someone you love while feeling an ache you cannot explain? It's a strange, heavy truth. The coping mechanisms you learned as a child never disappear. They simply grow up with you, slipping into your adult relationships like familiar ghosts. And so you move through your life wearing a mask that looks loyal, steady, committed, while somewhere deep inside, a quieter self is starving. You feel it in moments you can't quite name. A partner reaches for your hand, and instead of warmth, you feel a flicker of distance. A conversation becomes predictable, and your mind drifts to fantasies you never speak of. You sit at dinner, nodding at stories you've heard 100 times, and somewhere in your chest a small voice whispers, "I want something more. I want to feel alive again." That whisper doesn't come from cruelty. It comes from the secret rooms inside your mind where desire, insecurity, and old wounds still breathe. Attachment theorists say that when your childhood taught you to split yourself in two, adulthood becomes a stage where you perform one version and hide another. The facade of stability becomes your costume. On the outside, you appear loyal, responsible, present. But inside, the world is unstable, a storm kept behind closed doors. And the more you suppress your deeper needs, the more the shadow self begins to stir. This shadow is subtle at first. It doesn't push you into betrayal immediately. It simply craves attention, the kind that feels forbidden, intoxicating, thrilling. Someone compliments you at work, and your heart responds in a way you didn't expect. A stranger's smile feels like oxygen after months of emotional suffocation, and suddenly, the smallest spark becomes a dangerous flame. Not because you don't love the person beside you, but because the unhealed parts of you crave something they can't provide. Not because they're lacking, but because the emptiness began long before they ever entered your life. Neuroscience calls this the novelty loop, the brain's dopamine reward system seeking intensity when emotional needs go unmet. But to you, it doesn't feel scientific. It feels like waking up from a long sleep. It feels like freedom wrapped in guilt, like temptation disguised as connection. You tell yourself, "I love them, but this makes me feel alive." and the conflict tears quietly through your soul. You never planned to create a secret life, but cheating begins long before the act. It begins in the unspoken loneliness, in the admiration you chase from strangers, in the emotional disconnect you never dared to address. Desire becomes the monster fed by years of self-betrayal, standing right behind the mask you've worn for so long. But beneath the mask lies the deeper psychology science has documented for decades. Have you ever wondered why something that feels morally wrong can still feel emotionally irresistible? Why the heart can race toward danger even when the mind knows the consequences? Beneath every act of betrayal, beneath every secret message and every hidden longing, there is a psychological engine, quietly, running a brain wired by evolution, shaped by childhood, and triggered by unmet needs you may not even be aware of. You begin to see this when you understand attachment theory. An avoidant person, shaped by early emotional distance, learns to fear closeness and craves escape the moment intimacy feels suffocating. An anxious person, shaped by inconsistent love, seeks validation wherever it appears, even in the wrong places, even in places that promise intensity but not safety. Both carry emotional wounds that whisper dangerous promises. You'll feel better for a moment. You'll feel wanted. You'll feel alive. And sometimes, that whisper becomes louder than loyalty. Neuroscience shows how betrayal can feel like a drug. The dopamine reward system, the same circuit that fuels addiction, floods the brain during secrecy, novelty, and risk. Forbidden attention becomes a spark that lights up neural pathways long starved of excitement. The thrill isn't just about the other person. It's about the chemicals racing through your body, temporarily drowning out emptiness, boredom, or emotional hunger. In those moments, your brain becomes both the monster and the justification. Scientists call this ego depletion, the weakening of self-control when emotional energy is drained. When you're stressed, lonely, resentful, or disconnected, the mind begins searching for shortcuts to relief. A message from someone new, a conversation that feels flirtatious, a moment where admiration feels like oxygen. What seems like a moral failure is often the collapse of psychological defenses exhausted by years of inner conflict. Social psychology adds another layer. The human brain is remarkably skilled at splitting self-image from behavior. You can see yourself as a good person while doing something that contradicts that identity, a phenomenon known as moral licensing. You tell yourself, "I'm usually loyal. I've sacrificed so much. I deserve this one moment." And in that small moment, the boundary between what you are and what you do becomes blurry. Researchers also describe the unmet needs model, which explains how emotional starvation creates vulnerability. When your deeper needs, connection, admiration, intimacy, validation, remain unspoken or unmet, your brain unconsciously searches for substitutes. Not because you're weak, but because you're human, wired for connection the way a garden is wired for rain. Deprive it long enough, and it will find water anywhere it can. But even with all these theories, the chemicals, the wounds, the masks, something still remains unmeasured, untouched, unexplainable. Because science alone cannot explain the shadows a person carries. Have you ever felt that unsettling moment when someone smiles at you, yet something in their eyes flickers like a candle burning at both ends? It's a look you can't quite name, a softness mixed with distance, warmth tangled with something colder. This is where the shadow self lives, just beneath the skin, invisible to everyone except the person who carries it. And the truth is, when someone cheats, they aren't just stepping into a forbidden moment, they're stepping into the secret darkness within themselves. You sense this darkness most clearly in those quiet, lonely moments when you feel hollow and disconnected, even in a room full of people. A part of you aches for intensity, for validation, for a moment where you don't have to face your own thoughts. And suddenly, the smallest temptation becomes a door, a secret door you tell yourself you'll open only once. But once opened, it leads to a place you cannot easily escape from, a place where desire and self-destruction breathe in the same air. The shadow self whispers promises that feel like relief. You deserve this. No one will know. You're finally alive again. But what it doesn't say is that it will leave you emptier than before. Neuroscience calls this the escape response, the mind's desperate attempt to flee from fear, insecurity, or emotional starvation. The thrill of betrayal is not just about the other person, it's about escaping the monster of loneliness that sits inside you, waiting to be fed. When you cheat, the thrill mixes with guilt in a way that feels strangely intoxicating. Your hands tremble not just with desire, but with the weight of what you're risking. Your heart races because you know you're walking toward a fire, and yet part of you welcomes the burn. It's the paradox that psychologists write about endlessly. People don't cheat because they seek more. They often cheat because they feel less worthy, less seen, less connected, less alive. Cheating becomes a mirror reflecting the unresolved fractures inside you. It highlights the emptiness you've been avoiding, the self-doubt you've buried, the emotional hunger you pretend doesn't exist. You may think you are betraying someone else, but the first betrayal is always inward, a quiet abandonment of your own values, your own truth, your own unspoken wounds. The shadow self is not evil, it is wounded. It's the abandoned child inside you, the unmet need, the fear of inadequacy. But when ignored, it becomes the hidden monster behind the smile, charming, confident, self-assured on the outside, while quietly unraveling within. And yet, the tragedy is that society rarely helps us understand these shadows. It often makes them worse. Have you ever wondered why love feels heavier today than it ever did in the past? Why relationships collapse under pressures no one ever speaks about, while the world keeps insisting love should be effortless, pure, and unwavering? You grow up surrounded by fairy tales, dramas, and movies that show love as a flawless promise, two perfect people choosing each other forever. But no one teaches you how to hold someone through boredom, insecurity, or emotional drought. And so you enter adulthood believing that if love is difficult, something must be wrong with you. Society sells you romantic idealism while quietly hiding the truth about human complexity. You're told that one person should meet every emotional need, fulfill every desire, soothe every wound, sustain every spark. But inside, you know the truth. No human can be a full universe for another. Yet you feel guilty for even thinking that. You feel ashamed that the reality of love does not match the fantasy you were promised. And shame, unspoken and unnamed, becomes the quiet doorway to betrayal. In the age of social media, this pressure becomes suffocating. You scroll through curated moments, perfect vacations, perfect partners, perfect smiles, and somewhere inside you, a comparison begins to poison you. You start measuring your partner against strangers. You start measuring your relationship against illusions. You start measuring yourself against a world that does not exist. Desire becomes distorted. Admiration becomes temptation. And suddenly, the possibility of something better feels like a trap disguised as a dream. Cultural myths add even more shadows. As a man, you're taught that virility is power, that attention proves your worth, that desire from others validates who you are. As a woman, you're taught that desirability is everything, that being wanted defines your value, that losing attention means losing identity. These myths wrap themselves around your heart like quiet chains, convincing you that loyalty makes you small and temptation makes you significant. and so you begin to perform. You wear the mask society approves of. You pretend your relationship is perfect, even when your heart feels like a garden without water. You smile in photos, even when the silence between you and your partner feels louder than thunder. You become an actor in your own life, praised for appearances, rewarded for pretending, trapped in an emotional prison built by expectations you never agreed to. The irony is haunting. Society demands loyalty, but glamorizes temptation. It demands authenticity, but encourages masks. It demands commitment, but feeds your hunger for novelty. You're expected to be both deeply connected and perpetually desirable, both emotionally stable and endlessly exciting. And no human psyche can withstand this contradiction without cracking somewhere. And when these pressures collide with inner wounds, the emotional toll becomes catastrophic. Have you ever noticed how betrayal doesn't explode, it lingers? It sits quietly in the corners of your life, long after the moment has passed, like smoke that clings to everything it touches. You can feel it in the smallest things, the way your heart jumps when your phone lights up, the way you rehearse excuses in your mind even when no one is asking questions, the way silence becomes heavy, almost dangerous, as if the truth itself is pacing behind a closed door. For the person who cheats, the emotional aftermath is a twisted maze. You wake up in the morning and look at yourself in the mirror, and there's a flicker of someone you no longer recognize. Your smile feels rehearsed. Your confidence feels artificial. Somewhere beneath it all, a quiet self-loathing grows, not loud enough for others to hear, but sharp enough to cut you from the inside. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, the painful gap between who you believe you are and what you've done. And that gap widens every time you pretend everything is fine. Depression often follows, not always the dramatic kind, but the subtle kind that creeps in slowly, the exhaustion of managing a double life, the guilt that stains your thoughts like spilled ink, the fear that every vibration, every notification, every unexpected question might be the moment everything collapses. Your nervous system stays on high alert, flooded with stress hormones your body was never designed to carry for long. But the one who's been betrayed carries wounds just as deep, though different in shape. Their world doesn't break with a sound, it collapses silently, like a house sinking into its own foundation. You see it in their eyes, the way trust evaporates overnight, the way identity fractures, as they wonder what they lacked, what they missed, what they weren't enough for. Attachment theory explains this shattering clearly. When trust is broken, the brain interprets it as a threat, triggering panic, grief, and a desperate search for answers that never seem to satisfy. Intimacy becomes complicated. Touch feels unfamiliar. Words feel hollow. Every moment becomes a test, every silence a question, every hesitation a wound reopening. The emotional damage doesn't end with the relationship. It seeps into the way they see themselves, into the way they love, into the way they guard their heart long after the threat is gone. Yet beneath all this, there is a quiet truth both people suffer. The betrayer drowns in guilt, the betrayed drowns in grief. Two different hells, born from the same choice, but damage is not destiny. There is a path back not to who you were, but to who you must become. Have you ever noticed how healing doesn't begin the moment the truth comes out, but the moment you finally stop running from yourself? There is a silence after betrayal, a silence that feels almost like standing at the edge of a shattered mirror, staring at the pieces of who you were and who you pretended to be. And in that silence, you face the hardest truth of all. You cannot go back to the person you were before. You can only move towards someone wiser, braver, more honest, and more whole. Healing begins with a kind of radical self-honesty most people spend years avoiding. You sit with the discomfort instead of distracting yourself. You look directly at the shadow you've ignored, the loneliness you hid behind jokes, the resentment you buried beneath politeness, the unmet needs you tried to feed with secrecy. You begin to understand that cheating was never about desire alone. It was a symptom of something deeper, a signal flare from the parts of you that were starving for attention, safety, or truth. Psychologists say that growth requires integration, bringing back together the divided parts of yourself you exiled long ago. When you stop pretending you're fine, when you stop wearing the mask of strength or control, you start feeling the emotions that needed to be felt years before. Anger, shame, grief, fear. These emotions don't destroy you. They reveal the blueprint of what must be healed. And then comes emotional regulation, learning how to sit with longing without acting recklessly, how to face boredom without seeking escape, how to express pain without hurting someone else. You start recognizing triggers that once pulled you toward danger. You learn to breathe through them instead of betraying yourself again. If you were the one who betrayed someone, rebuilding trust becomes its own quiet discipline, not through promises, but through transparency. Not through grand gestures, but through consistency day after day, truth after truth, effort after effort. You learn boundaries not as limitations, but as the structure that protects love from collapsing again. You learn self-worth not through validation from others, but through the courage to be honest, even when it is uncomfortable. And if you were the one betrayed, healing means reclaiming pieces of yourself you thought were lost. It means understanding that someone else's wound is not a reflection of your inadequacy. It means allowing your heart to grieve without letting grief define you. You begin to rebuild your identity with gentler hands, remembering that you deserve love rooted in truth, not fear. Healing after betrayal is not a return to innocence, it is a rebirth into clarity. It is the moment the split self begins to unify, the moment the shadow stops being a monster and becomes a messenger. And when the truth is finally faced, something profound happens. Have you ever noticed how love begins with a small moment of honesty? A glance where nothing is hidden. A confession whispered in vulnerability. A feeling spoken instead of suppressed. And have you noticed how love dies in the opposite way? Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, through 1,000 unspoken truths. Betrayal rarely starts with desire. It starts with disconnection. Not just from the person beside you, but from the person within you. You see it when you imagine a child who once told the truth freely, before they learned that honesty could break the peace. You see it when you picture an adult who looks in the mirror and realizes they've spent years being loyal to everyone except themselves. And somewhere between those two versions, something gets lost, to the courage to live honestly, to love transparently, to exist without the mask that has become second skin. Cheating, at its core, is not a story about passion. It is a story about absence of communication, absence of emotional safety, absence of self-understanding. A person betrays when they no longer know how to express their hunger, their loneliness, their longing. They betray when the shadow inside them speaks louder than the truth they fear revealing. They betray because they feel small, disconnected, unseen, not because the other person is unworthy, but because they themselves feel unworthy of being fully known. And yet, despite all the pain that betrayal brings, there is a strange kind of clarity that follows it. You begin to realize that love cannot survive inside a house of secrets. It cannot grow in a garden without water, cannot breathe beneath layers of pretense and fear. Love requires truth, the way the body requires air without it. Everything slowly suffocates. Healing begins the moment you stop running from your shadow and let it sit beside you. The moment you admit what you feel instead of hiding it. The moment you understand that truth may hurt, but falseness destroys. When you choose honesty over comfort, clarity over confusion, sincerity over performance, you give love a chance to survive. Not the fantasy of love, but the real, imperfect, human kind that grows stronger by being seen in its entirety. And if you've been betrayed, the truth becomes your doorway too. Because healing is not about fixing the past, it is about reclaiming yourself. It is about realizing that someone else's emptiness was never your responsibility to fill. At the end of it all, love is simple. It survives where truth lives, and it dies where truth is denied. And the heart, your heart, always knows the difference between someone who chooses you and someone who chooses their emptiness.